We are back on the record at the beginning of media number 2 of Elizabeth Holmes. The time is 10:30.
And Ms. Holmes, I just wanted to confirm, we didn't have any substantive conversations during the break, did we?
No.
Okay, and I just want to make that give you that question after every break, just to make sure that nothing was said off the record.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to hand to you what's been marked as Theranos Exhibit 195. For everyone else, this is tab 10. Exhibit 195 purports to be a document entitled Theranos Confidential Summary Capitalization. The starting base number is TS-000603. I'll represent to you that this was produced by Theranos to the SEC as part of a binder that was provided by Theranos to Rupert Murdoch when he was considering whether to invest in Theranos in December 2014 and January 2015. The cover letter to the binder states that it was signed as of December 4th, 2014. Have you seen Exhibit 195 before?
You know, I didn't recognize this first sheet sitting here now, but I'm sure I did.
What is Exhibit 195?
It looks like our cap table, and behind it a series of projections.
Did you review Exhibit 195 on or about December 4th, 2014?
I don't have memory of whether I reviewed it at that time, but I know I've seen it.
So I'm actually just going to start on the first page, which is 603 is the base number at the bottom.
Yes.
Is this an accurate reflection of Theranos' capital raising since the company was founded?
As of what period of time?
I guess as of 2013. That's a good point.
As of 2013. No. I think this was as of a later period of time.
Okay. So what was the date at which this document was prepared then?
The C2 didn't happen until I think 2014 was the first part of the C2.
Okay. So you think that this is an accurate reflection of the capital raising the company did as of 2014?
No.
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 Okay. So what happened in 2014?
Oh, I'm sorry. As of 2014, I was missing my years. Yes, I think that as of the end of 2014, this looks about right.
This looks
yes.
about right. Okay.
Yeah.
And how much was raised during the C2 round?
It was several $100 million. I don't know exactly the end number. I think it was over 500 million.
Okay. So if it was over 500 million, then do you think that this chart maybe isn't an accurate reflection? At least it doesn't include some of the C2 round?
Correct. It doesn't include some of the C2. I don't know exactly when this was prepared and what period of time it was supposed to be reflective of.
Okay. But you think that the total for the C2 round would have been something like over $500 million?
I believe so.
So I just want to focus for a period on the C1 and C2 rounds. What were those financing rounds? What was the purpose of raising money during those rounds?
So they were different at different points in time. C1, we began developing strategic relationships with long-term shareholders, and some of the hospital systems that we wanted to partner with came in through a fund. And then C2, we had decided that we wanted to try to structure Theranos as a private company, and we were looking for family-owned businesses or family-controlled companies and leadership who wanted to invest in something for the really long term, and we identified a group of people to try to bring in for that.
So you said for the C1 round, I just want to make sure that I understand. For the C1 round, that was mainly money coming from strategic partners like hospitals and
When it started,
businesses?
yes. Yeah, I mean, we had also another family that invested through one of the funds that came in C1, and then a couple of the hospital systems that we were hoping to partner with came in that as well.
Which family came in C1 that you're thinking of?
This family.
Okay. And did family and the hospital systems, they all come in through Pure Venture Group?
They did.
What is Pure Venture Group?
It is a fund.
What was your relationship with them?
For a long time, and I met him through.
Okay. And so how did that relationship come about? You know, who initiated talks of potentially investing in Theranos? You know, and what happened? How were you able to get that investment from Pure Venture Group?
So the first one was in 2010, so I don't remember specifically, but my memory is that had expressed interest about investing in Theranos, and specifically sort of having a fund that focused on investing in Theranos, and strongly encouraged me to meet with him and the people that I think he was working to raise money from, and to invest.
Okay, and then you mentioned for C2 that was mainly for you to raise money in order to establish a long-term shareholder base. Is that right? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, over a period of time, we became convinced that becoming a private company for the long term would best allow us to do something that was going to be a very long-term venture, and so we were trying to find investors who wanted to invest in private companies and wanted to make really long-term investments, and generally who had built family companies. And so we identified a series of people who had done that and went to meet with them to talk about this vision. And so that was the majority of the C2.
What was the money that you raised during the C1 and C2 rounds used for?
A lot of R&D and operational investments. Like we built a big manufacturing facility in Newark, California, where we do our own injection molding and machining and reagent production, and I think primarily those two things.
Going into both of these rounds of financing, did you have a particular target that you were aiming to raise? And what were those targets?
I don't know. I'm sure we did. I can't remember exactly what the numbers were. I think it was also a bit dynamic in terms of responding to interest and people who had expressed interest in being shareholders in the company.
So if you look at the price at which the shares were sold during these two rounds, the first C1 round that took place in 2010, the price was $3 a share. The second C1 round, it went up to $15. What precipitated the change in price?
So my memory is that was a price per share that was established through the relationships with the retail pharmacy partners who were thinking about what the value of Theranos could be if we had these retail frameworks in place, and that's where that number came from.
So are you saying then that the retail partners actually valued Theranos at the $15 a share?
I don't know if they valued it, but to the extent there were provisions in the contract that gave them potential rights to equity, that was the value that they put on the equity rights that they had.
Who came up with the $15 per share valuation?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Was that a number that Theranos requested of its retail partners?
You know, I don't remember. I know there was a lot of work with the retail partners to create models together of what this could be. I'm not sure who settled on that number in the end.
Was it negotiated?
I don't think so.
Who would know the answer to that question?
I mean, I assume our team could look back at documents and try to figure it out. I don't remember. I'm not sure.
Would you have been involved in those discussions with your retail partners?
I would have, yes.
Would Sunny Balwani have been involved?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to hand you another document. You can put that one aside. Handing to you what's been marked as Theranos Exhibit 196. Exhibit 196 purports to be a spreadsheet. The title at the top is Detailed 2917. Starting base number is TS-0558077. Have you seen Exhibit 196 before?
You know, I don't remember seeing this version, but I recognize it as our cap table.
Did you review Exhibit 196 on or around February 9th, 2017?
I don't remember doing that.
I'll represent to you that that's the date at which that appears on the document,
Okay.
and would have been around the date that Theranos produced the document to the SEC.
Yep.
So I want to focus on some of the C1 and C2 investors on this list. So if you go down, there's an investor called Bendel Fund. Do you see that on the first page?
I do.
And they invested, let's say, in 249,998 shares in the C2 round. Who is the Bendel Fund?
I believe this is he's an individual company.
How do you know him? Or how did you get to know him?
I met him through this process of trying to find family-controlled companies and investors, and I'm trying to remember who made the introduction. He knows a number of people affiliated with the company. I'm not quite sure who made the final introduction to him.
Who does he know at the company?
He knows some of our investors. He knows some of our board members specifically. I'm just not sure who made the first introduction to him.
Who are the investors that he knew?
My understanding is he knows most of our C2 investors, the other large family investors.
What about Central Valley administrators? Who are they? It's on the
So
second
I
page.
think that is that Walgreens introduced us to when they were talking about deploying in California.
Who's okay? And why was he interested in Theranos?
I think he really believes in the need for lower cost, more distributed testing.
Were you in talks to partner with him in any way?
It was our hope that had we deployed in Los Angeles with Walgreens, we would work with his physician groups.
So was he also considered a strategic partner, a possible strategic partner?
Yes.
So in other words, even though he invested in the C2 round, it looks like there were also also opportunities for strategic partners to come in the C2 round in addition to some of these families.
I'm trying to think if there are any others beside him. I know generally the focus of C2 was the families. But had there been a strategic, I mean, there's no reason why we wouldn't have looked at that in the context of involvement.
If you turn the page to page 3, what about Dynasty Financial? It's also a C2 round investor.
I believe that's the DeVos family.
The DeVos family. How did you know them?
I met them at a conference for family-controlled companies, and I talked to them about our vision.
What conference is that?
That was the conference. I think it was in Chicago.
And what is, so they invited a number of family offices to come for a conference?
I think so, yes.
When did that happen?
In the fall of 2014, or maybe winter of 2014.
Why did you attend?
I was asked to speak at it.
What did you speak about?
Had asked me to serve on a panel, I think, about innovation. I don't remember what I talked about. I'm sorry.
You don't recall what you talked about at that conference?
I don't. I mean, I guess. I don't remember it specifically.
Did you meet the DeVos family at that conference?
I did.
Who was your main contact there?
Initially, it was now.
Who's
She's, my understanding,
and
her boss.
Is he, or
I think so. I'm not sure.
what about Hall Black Diamond 2, which is towards the bottom of page 3? Who are they?
So that is a fund that was created for one of the limited partners of Black Diamond to be able to have direct holdings in Theranos.
And who?
Black Diamond, and I think a successful business person.
How did you meet him?
I believe I met him after he had invested in Black Diamond's fund that invested in Theranos, so through Black Diamond.
And was there somebody else at Black Diamond that you knew prior to this relationship? Who? If you turn the page to page 4, at the very top, who is?
That is, my understanding is it's the foundation affiliated with his family.
And who's?
He's a businessman.
When did you first contact with him?
I think in 2014, but I'm not completely sure.
How did you meet him?
I met him. I think I met him at someone's house, and we started having a conversation about healthcare.
Do you recall whose house you met him at?
I think it was a Silicon Valley venture capitalist.
What did you talk about?
We talked about the need to make lab testing lower cost and more accessible, and the need to invest in technologies that can leapfrog over traditional lab infrastructure, kind of like cell phones did over landlines, and how important that's going to be for healthcare.
Is he in the healthcare business?
He is, yes.
What is his business?
And also a number of other businesses. He owns retail grocery stores that include pharmacies and many other businesses.
Did you ever have any discussions about partnering with his businesses?
We did.
And how did those discussions go?
They were very positive. He has a foundation that we've interacted with most closely that's talked to us about a number of different projects, including our current focus on Zika virus testing in low income and distributed areas.
Did you end up entering into a contract with him or his companies?
I don't know if we have a contract with their foundation. I'm not sure. Not his laboratory business.
Okay. Let's turn the page to page 6. Towards the top of the page, there's an investor called Sandhill Financial Company, Sandbox Co-Investment Fund. Who are they?
So I think these are two different ones.
Oh, they're two different ones.
Yeah.
Okay, then I am asking about Sandbox Co-Investment Fund, since they're a C1 investor.
Yes, so they are, as I understand it, the fund that manages the investments for the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association.
And how did you get in contact with them?
So this is, I think, in 2010, and I'm not sure. I think it was our board member Robert Shapiro was an advisor to the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association Fund and part of Sandbox, and I think he made the introduction. It may have come from somewhere else, but that sounds right.
What was your understanding of why they were interested in investing in Theranos?
Because the lab companies have been charging them at extremely high rates, and they've been negotiating for years to try to break up the duopoly of pricing between Quest and LabCorp, and they thought that we could build a lab company that would offer really low cost testing.
And then further down the page, Soda Spring Partners. Who are they?
That is Alice Walton, part of the Walton family.
Part of the Walton family. And how did you get to know the Walton family?
I can't remember the first introduction. I think my first contact with them was with Greg Penner, who's the chairman at Walmart. I don't know who introduced me to him. He was certainly one of the families that, as we brainstormed on who were the types of people that would want to be part of taking something like this on, that we thought about.
When you're, I think you just said he was one of the people, so do you mean the Walton family or do you mean Walmart?
Well, what I was referring to was that the Walton family is one of the great, sort of family-controlled businesses that's been built in this country. We absolutely were also interested in the relationship with Walmart, and that was early on part of our discussions with Greg.
Part of your discussions with Greg were to potentially partner with Walmart in the retail pharmacy space?
Yes. And specifically, I think he wanted them to evaluate the promise of this.
Did you ever enter into a contract with Walmart?
I don't think so.
Did you have any other business relationship with them, aside from having these discussions?
Prior to meeting Greg, we'd had a fair amount of interaction with them. There was no formal contract about how you would roll out. The concept was $4 lab testing, like they'd done $4 pharmacy prescriptions.
Okay. And did anything come of that? Did you end up either piloting or rolling out any services, even if you didn't have a contract?
No, we were prohibited under the terms of our Walgreens and Safeway contracts initially from doing that for some period of time.
Did Greg Penner introduce you to Alice Walton? Or did someone else introduce you to the Walton family members?
I believe was the point person for Alice. I met Alice at a dinner separately. I think she was sitting near me. But I know works with her.
Did you ever meet Rob Walton?
I did.
What do you recall about that?
I recall talking to him about this concept of $4 lab testing and the vision for what we were trying to do in the lab space in terms of access to health information. I recall telling him about the technology we were working to implement, and I recall initially focusing on what this could be if we did have the opportunity at some point to partner with Walmart. And then later he became an investor. He's Greg's father-in-law.
How did he become an investor?
So
You mean what vehicle?
Yeah, or is he, is he on the list, or was there an entity invested through?
Yes, the Madrone entity is him and Greg and the associated fund partners.
So, in looking through Exhibit 196, we actually noticed that Rupert Murdoch doesn't appear on here. Do you know why? Is he an investor? Or was he an investor in Theranos?
He was an investor in Theranos, yes.
Oh. Was he taken out? Is he still an investor in Theranos today?
He is not.
Is that the reason why he doesn't appear on this list?
I don't know why he doesn't appear on this list.
Do you know who prepares, the capitalization table for Theranos, or who maintains it?
It's changed over time. It's used to. I think now it's done by one of our legal firms.
Okay. But in the 2013, 2014 timeframe, it would have maintained it.
I believe so. Yes.
So were you involved in discussions with the investors in the C1 and C2 round to invest in Theranos?
I was.
What was your involvement?
I would talk about the kind of company we were trying to build, talk about the vision, talk about why we were interested in structuring this as a private company and sort of the long-term nature of it, and what we thought we have the potential to do here.
Were you involved in providing materials to them for their due diligence purposes?
I was involved. Just so I answer the question correctly, what do you mean by that?
So were you aware that these investors would sometimes request materials or documents from Theranos?
Yes.
And were you involved in compiling that information or collecting that information for them?
I don't know if I specifically did that, but I knew that the materials were going to investors.
Okay. Would you review those materials or documents before they were sent to investors?
I would need to think about a specific instance to be able to speak about it specifically. I certainly was generally aware of the types of content that we were sending to investors.
What were the types of content that you were sending to investors?
I mean, we had a very informal process in place, which was decks that we used for a number of different purposes in terms of slides. We would share. They had data on the performance of our chemistries. We would share other information that we thought just gave people a perspective of what we were trying to do. Right? It was a startup, so we didn't have the systems in place to do this in a formal way.
Would you sometimes be the person sending the materials to investors, either through email or?
I could have been. I can't sit here and say I remember a specific instance in which I did, but it wouldn't surprise me if I did.
What was Sunny Balwani's role in those discussions with investors?
I would generally do the first meeting or two and talk about the vision, and then he would follow up on any questions that they had from a diligence perspective and provide them with that information.
Did he attend those initial meetings that you had with investors?
Most of the time, yes.
Did he participate in those meetings? Would he be presenting material as well, or was it mostly just you talking?
The meetings that I was in, which were sort of the initial meetings, we didn't frequently present anything. It was just discussion, and yes, he would be involved in the discussion as well.
Was there anyone else from the company who was involved in those investor discussions besides you and Mr. Balwani?
I'm sure there were others in the room for certain meetings. I would need to think about a specific meeting to be able to talk about who else was in there.
Okay. Would there be others who would be making a presentation to investors during those meetings? So I'm more interested in the people who would have been speaking at those meetings. Can you think of anyone who would have, besides you and Mr. Balwani, who would have been speaking at those meetings?
I mean, if you give me a specific meeting, I could try to think back to it. There's a lot of meetings over a period of many years. We had people and we generally tried to respond to any questions that an investor had. So if they wanted to focus on a specific area, we might have had people who were specific to that area engage. But I can't sit here and recall a specific example.
Were there particular areas that you would present on and particular areas that Mr. Balwani would present on? And what were those areas?
Yeah, I presented the vision, right? What we're trying to build, what we've invented, and what we think it could do. Sonny would present on our projections, what we thought it could mean financially, and on the operations of the business, whether it be on manufacturing or the clinical lab.
When you were sitting in meetings with Mr. Balwani and you're having these discussions with investors, were there times when Mr. Balwani would present something to investors that you thought was not right or inaccurate?
I don't remember an instance in which that ever happened. I generally understood at least what I saw to be the assumptions behind how he characterized our potential.
So when you say you saw the assumptions behind how he would characterize your potential, what do you mean by that?
I mean, our projections were generally based on an assumption that we would have a certain retail footprint, and I knew that we had the ability to get that footprint if we executed, and so I assumed that those numbers made sense in that context.
So you would have reviewed the assumptions before Mr. Balwani was presenting these financials to investors?
Not necessarily. I'm sure sometimes I did, but not as a necessary normal operating cadence.
But you can't think of an instance in which Mr. Balwani would have presented, for instance, the financials to investors that you thought was incorrect or inaccurate?
You're talking about the projections?
I'm talking about the financial projections now, yes.
Not at that time, no.
Can you think of any instance in which Mr. Balwani made any other inaccurate or incorrect statements to investors, setting aside the financial projections?
I mean, not when I was in the room, not that I can remember.
Had he made an inaccurate or incorrect statement to investors, would you have corrected him?
Absolutely.
And were there times when Mr. Balwani corrected you while you were making your presentation to investors?
I mean, he was not shy about jumping in on things that I would say, so he was definitely very vocal in those meetings.
Was there ever a topic in those discussions with investors in which you felt like you were not sufficiently familiar with it and so couldn't speak to it?
Me personally?
Yes.
For sure.
What were those topics?
I mean, this is why I deferred to other people on the operations of our clinical lab, on our operational infrastructure internally in terms of production, on financials and financial modeling. I didn't have any training or background in that.
Were there any other areas?
I'm sure there were. I mean, I try to be good in a couple of things, which generally have to do with inventing and sort of ideas and vision. I tried to surround myself with people who I thought were better than I was in other areas.
What about the product development area? Were you sufficiently familiar with that area to be able to speak to investors about it?
Insofar as the architecture of our technology, like the idea of, for example, putting a robot in a distributed testing system, yes. Insofar as how to interpret the data or the standards, I relied on our teams.
Okay, and so I think you said two things. In terms of the data and what standards should be applied, you relied on your teams. So
Yeah.
who was in charge of those two things at the company?
So it depended on what data and what standards. From the perspective of R&D, it was our development or product leads who were the different team leads that were in place at different points in time. From the perspective of our clinical lab, it was...
So in the 2013 timeframe, that would have been, are you talking about, was there another person that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I'm trying to go back and remember who the team leads were in 2013, because it evolved and we were generally trying to promote these scientists from within. But yes, those are the types of people who would ensure that the assays were developed to the standards that we thought we were developing them to.
Okay. And then you said the lab director for the clinical lab. So was that then in the 2013 timeframe?
At that time, yes.
Okay. Would you be kept apprised of what assays had been developed over the course of time? Was that something that you would be apprised of?
It was, yes. I mean, we had sort of tracking spreadsheets at different periods of time to say, okay, how many assays have sort of hit these different steps that we thought were required to develop and validate the assays.
And then would you also be kept apprised of how many of those had been transferred onto the hardware, onto the devices, the analyzers that would be analyzing the blood samples?
I don't know that we ever tracked it like that. We always thought about it as you're developing chemistries that could work on small samples and with these standardized tube types, so you didn't need all the different color tubes. And then you could put them onto different hardware platforms. And that ultimately became a business decision around the business model that we decided to go with.
So you just said that you didn't really think about that too much, but why wasn't that important to the process, you know, actually putting the assays onto the machine? Because the machine is the device that would actually be conducting the testing.
Well, you first need to know what your deployment is, right? So if you're trying to deploy for a pharmaceutical clinical trial and you're trying to put machines in a distributed setting, then getting those assays validated on those machines makes sense. And during that period of time, we were mostly trying to develop a wide assay menu to show that this belief we had that any of these chemistries could be made to work with small samples was possible. And so that was our primary focus. And then when it became time to go into the clinical lab, we focused on putting them onto the specific hardware platforms that we decided to put them on.
So were you kept apprised as to, so you said at some point it was important to actually validate the tests.
Yes.
But were you apprised of that process and how many tests have been validated on the platforms?
I think generally, yes. In terms of like the total number of tests that we were working to bring up in the lab initially is what I'm thinking about.
So generally you were apprised of the number of tests that were validated on each of the platforms?
I don't think I knew specifically how many were on each platform. I knew, for example, when we launched, that generally we were working to bring up a menu of 70 tests on fingerstick, and we thought that would cover the ordering patterns we were going to see. I knew that there was, certain general numbers on different platforms, but it wasn't like, okay, today, something came up on this platform and I was alerted to that.
Okay, and were there any areas, going back to my question about areas that you weren't familiar with to speak with investors about, were there any areas that you had an understanding Mr. Balwani wouldn't have felt familiar with or comfortable talking to investors about?
No.
So he would have been familiar with all aspects of the company, including, for instance, the vision and the mission of the company as well?
Yeah, I mean, he's very confident, and he was confident that he was able to fill the role that he was in and supplement the knowledge that he needed with other people.
So you can put that aside now. So I want to go back to the 2010 time period for the time being. And I want to start by asking sort of a series of questions, but if I use the word analyzers, would you understand that that's what I mean is the device that's used to process blood tests?
Yeah, and I would then ask you which
Which
ones.
analyzer?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll go through, and it would be helpful if you could actually explain what the different devices are and the
Yeah.
versions. And if I'm not being sufficiently clear, please let me know if I'm not being clear.
Sure.
So in the 2010 time period, I think you mentioned previously there were two devices that had been developed and that were in use. There was the 3.5 mini lab and the 4 series mini lab. Do you remember that testimony earlier?
Yes.
Okay.
And just to be clear, that's referring to what I'm sort of generally referring to as this mini lab family, or the devices that were intended to be distributed.
Okay. So, and then you mentioned there was also a 3.0, but that was similar to the 3.5 version.
Yes.
But we're not sure as to what the differences are between those two versions. Do you have any understanding?
I don't know specifically.
Okay. So starting with 3.5 machine, was
Yeah.
that the machine that you believed would be used for clinical testing, or was ready for clinical testing at that time?
2010, we're talking about?
Yeah, I'm just talking about 2010.
Used for clinical, what do you mean by used for clinical testing?
Well, in 2010, were you thinking about getting into a relationship with Walgreens and Safeway and thinking about rolling this out to retail pharmacy partners?
We were.
Okay, so that's the clinical testing that I'm
Got it.
thinking of.
Yep.
So, well, let me step back. So the 3.5 version, was that the version that you were thinking would be used for clinical testing purposes at the retail pharmacies?
At that time, we believed it could be.
Okay, you believed it could be. What do
Yes.
you mean by that?
What I understood as of that period of time is that the standards that were required to satisfy the assay criteria for a pharma trial were the FDA standards, I thought, and the FDA standards that meant your data was good enough for clinical decision making. So we believed that the exact process that we'd gone through for validating the assays there would allow it to be used in a clinical setting. We knew you would need to get the CLIA waiver and regulatory approval from the FDA.
Okay. I'm sorry, so you said you knew that you needed to get approval from the FDA
Yes.
before using it for clinical testing?
Yes.
This was back in 20
distributed setting,
In a distributed setting. So
Yeah.
what do you mean by distributed setting?
outside of a certified clinical lab.
Okay. And we're talking about 2010. Is that right?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
And then you mentioned that your understanding as to how the machines needed to be validated was how they were validated for the clinical trials you were doing for pharmaceutical companies.
Yes.
Is that right?
How the tests were, yes.
Okay. So what was that validation process that you undertook for the pharmaceutical companies?
My understanding was that there's an FDA guidance document on a series of steps. There's like 15 steps on sensitivity and specificity and other measurements that ensure that the data is good enough to be used for clinical decision making. And at that time, we thought that was what was in our development reports and what was going to be required for FDA submission.
Okay. And who was in charge of the process of validating the devices to make them ready for clinical testing? Who was overseeing that process
In 2010,
in 2010?
I don't know. We always think about it in terms of tests, not devices, and I again defer to whoever was leading the assay initiatives at that time.
Who was leading the assay initiatives?
I can't remember in 2010. I don't know.
Who would know who was in charge of that process?
I'm sure we can look back and tell you. I don't know if Sunny would remember. We could talk to some of our other scientists internally.
Okay. And then on that version 3.5 mini lab,
Yes.
I think you mentioned previously, earlier in testimony, that that version could conduct, you said, tens of tests?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
What? And I think we talked about how that was something less than 100.
Yes.
What types of tests could it conduct?
So that version of device was focused on a method called immunochemistry, and it was running those types of tests for, I believe, small molecules, proteins, maybe metabolites, and antibodies. I'm not completely sure.
So what about, and then I guess we talked a little bit about the 4 series as well, the 4 series mini lab.
Yes.
So I think you mentioned that that was in development and there were different sectors that were being developed in the machine. Do you remember that discussion?
I do.
So what was being done with the 4 series mini lab?
So the core of our invention was the concept of taking a robot that could replicate what a human does and putting it into a small box that could be used outside of a lab. The 3 series detected the signals from the chemistries through one form of detection called luminescence, which is measuring light, measuring photons. And what we wanted to do was add other detectors or capability of other light forms like fluorescence. So we were mounting other detectors around it, and that's what the 4 series is.
Okay. So what could the 4 series test in terms of, like what were the numbers of tests that the 4 series could perform at that time?
I don't know. I think I'd be guessing. Yeah.
Could it perform any number of tests?
We had essentially, I mean, my memory is we'd essentially shown proof of concept of the ability to do what I just said. I don't know how many chemistries we'd actually put on it at that time.
Yes. So
Yeah.
just to understand, the adding the additional, let's say the fluorescence capability,
Yep.
would that enable the 4 series to conduct tests in theory beyond the immunochemistry set? Is that a fair understanding?
Yes, and most importantly, we were trying to invent a platform that could do, the objective was anything that a lab could do, so we needed the full range of options that are in a lab so that if a test came along that we hadn't tried to develop yet, we had a box that could do it, right, architecturally.
And I mean, just broadly, what kind of tests are immunochemistry tests?
So those are the ones I was talking about: proteins, antibodies, small molecules, drug levels, could be metabolites, essentially anything that you bind to with an antibody.
And then what were sort of, other than the category of immunochemistry tests, what were the other kind of categories of tests that were sort of in that universe that you wanted to have the architecture for the 4 series?
Yeah, and so just to be clear, immunochemistry is a method, right? It's not a category of tests.
Okay.
There's many different types of tests that can be done with the method of immunochemistry. We wanted to be able to do essentially a broad range of methods, right? So we wanted to have what's called a microscopy method for imaging of cells. We wanted to have fluorescence as a readout for measuring RNA and DNA for pathogen detection. And I can list the other detectors that were in there and what they're for if it's useful.
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, so imaging, fluorescence, microscopy, we still had the luminescence capability and absorbance. So it's essentially the full range of readouts. What we were trying to do is take the lab and put it in a box, right?
Did you ever use that phrase when talking to other people, lab in a box?
I wouldn't be surprised if I did. I can't sit here saying I remember a specific conversation. Yeah, we most often talked about the concept of mini lab, which was miniaturized laboratory.
So I want to skip forward then to a few years later now, and we're talking again about 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what devices Theranos had developed to process blood tests at that time.
So when the clinical lab went live, which I believe was in, I think we did our first sort of official patient testing around the end of October 2013. The date is probably not exact. We had both our 3.5 mini lab devices as well as what we called at that time high throughput platforms, which are open systems that you can put your proprietary protocols on to run small sample testing. And so those included a number of different devices, one of which was the ADVIA 1800. There was a cytometry one that was made by Becton Dickinson, and I believe there was a couple others.
Okay, so just going back, so you said there was the TSPU, or the mini lab. What are we calling it at this time?
At that time, we were calling it the TSPU.
Okay, so there's the TSPU. Which version was it?
I believe that was the 3.5 version.
It was still the 3.5
Yes.
version. Okay, and how many tests could be run on the 3.5?
Do you mean how many were run in the clinical lab or could be run?
I mean, how many were validated to be run for clinical testing?
I believe that we brought up about 15 in the clinical lab at that time.
About 15?
Yes.
Okay, and what time frame in 2013 are you referring to when you say about 15? Are you thinking about before the launch of Theranos services in Walgreens?
I was thinking of sort of the initial launch of the services in Walgreens. So when the lab formally started seeing patients through to the next few months, let's say 3 to 4 months after. I don't know exactly when the tests were validated in that range.
Okay. So you think about 15 tests were validated on the TSPU 3.5.
Yes.
And then you mentioned there were other open platforms, including the ADVIA 1800, some machine that was manufactured by, what was it, Beckman?
Yes.
What's the name of the company?
Not the ADVIA, but there was another one that was
another
manufactured by Beckman Coulter.
Coulter, okay. So what did Theranos do to those machines?
You know what? It could have been Becton Dickinson. I'm sorry. I'm not sure. One of the two.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what had Theranos done to those open platform machines in order to make it capable for these machines to be processing tests on smaller samples?
Yeah. So different modifications for different platforms. Speaking about the ADVIA specifically, we had taken our protocol, which is essentially our formula for how to make the chemistry work with a small volume, and as I understand it, overtaken essentially the software in the instrument to implement our protocol, and then we modified the physical hardware. There's little cups that are used to contain the sample, and one of the reasons that people take so much blood in blood testing is that those cups have a lot of loss. So even though you only take out a tiny amount, you have to leave behind a lot of loss in the cup. And so we changed the geometry so that you didn't have that loss. And Then on other open platforms, like for the cells, it was our chemistries that were run on them too. So we actually made like the antibody in the chemistry that binded to the cell that lit up to go into the assay.
Okay. So the Advia 1800, you mentioned a couple other machines that were made by another company. These were all machines that weren't manufactured by Theranos. Is that right?
Correct. We purchased the machines and then we modified the hardware.
You modified the hardware. So, so we might be talking about this a lot during today. So if I said, if I refer to these machines as, third-party commercially available machines, would you understand that I'm talking about the Advia 1800? Anything that the Theranos had not manufactured? Would you understand that?
So I think it's important to distinguish that there were also actual third-party commercial machines that were not modified that were in the laboratory as well.
Okay.
So we had both platforms that we were doing hardware modifications as well as unmodified commercial machines.
Okay. So it sounds like there were three categories of machines then, right? There's the TSPU 3.5 version
Yes.
that Theranos had manufactured.
Correct.
Is that right? And then there was the some third-party commercially available machines that Theranos had modified.
Correct.
And then there were also just other third-party commercially available machines that Theranos had purchased in order to conduct testing. Would that be via
Yes.
venous draw?
Yes.
So these machines would be conducting testing in sort of the traditional venipuncture way.
Yes, and I believe there was also a couple of point-of-care devices that were in the lab. Like, I don't think it was a glucose meter, but kind of like a glucose meter. But they were commercial, unmodified. You just wouldn't be putting venous blood on them. Does that make sense?
Okay. I think I understand that.
Can I ask for just a clarification on the hardware modified commercially available devices, sort of that second category that you just referenced?
Yes.
And you mentioned the hardware modification was, I guess that the modifications were sort of the software programming the machine and then the geometry of the cup. Is that fair?
Yes, and on other instruments, it was also our, what I sometimes call chemistry, which is essentially we did the work to make the antibody or the binder, and then we made all the other reagents, like for the cytometry assays, and then put them on these platforms that could then run our tests.
Earlier we sort of talked about the idea of a consumable being what was put in the device.
Yes.
Is the modified geometry tube, for lack of a better word on my part, is that sort of also a consumable for that platform?
It is. I was speaking specifically to the conversation about the TSPU and what a consumable was to it, but there's consumables there and there's other consumables like the nanotainers.
Okay. And is it would you consider at the time a reagent to be a consumable as well?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't now.
So we've been going about an hour. Can we take another break, short break?
Sure.
We're off the record at 11:30. We are back on the record at 11:46.
Ms. Holmes, did you have any substantive conversations with the SEC staff during the break?
I did not.
So we were talking about modifying some of these third-party commercially available machines in order to test smaller samples before we left on the break. When were these machines modified?
So I believe the way I think about it is the implementation of our protocols onto them happened in 2013 before the clinical lab went live, I think.
Okay. And why did Theranos have to develop these modified protocols during that time period?
Well, just to be clear, the protocols themselves date back to our original inventions in like 2005. The reason that we had to implement them on those open platforms was because we needed to process large numbers of samples in a centralized lab environment, as opposed to the TSPUs are designed to be near a patient and process one sample at a time, and I think it takes like 30 minutes to an hour per sample, and we needed to be able to run a lot of samples at the same time in a centralized setting. So that was why we were trying to figure out how to do this in a high throughput way.
So the TSPU could only process one sample at a time?
That's right.
Okay, and you mentioned how long would it take to process that sample?
It depends on the chemistry. It could be anywhere from 18 minutes to an hour.
And I think you mentioned...
It could be different times too. I mean, it varied per test.
Okay. You mentioned before we took the break, at the time in 2013 when you were getting ready to launch Theranos' services through Walgreens, that the TSPU was validated to run about 15 tests. Do you remember that earlier testimony?
I do, and again, forgive me, I think there were 15 tests in the clinical lab that were validated on the TSPU, if that makes sense.
Okay. What was the distinction between what I was saying and what you were
Yeah,
saying?
yeah, sorry. The way that I think about it is that the TSPU itself, we had thought at that time was validated to run a lot of tests, which, you know, at one point we got up to about over 300 chemistries that we developed, and many of them, like 90 or so, I think were actually on the TSPU. 15 we had validated as laboratory developed tests in the clinical lab as of that time, I believe.
Okay, so just so that I'm clear and I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So you're saying there were about 300 or so that the TSPU was, or that Theranos had developed assays for.
Right.
About something I think we had talked about in 2010, something like less than 100 were, maybe you should explain it again, because
Sure.
I'm not really understanding what the difference
Yeah.
is between what was validated in 2010 and what was validated in 2013.
Yeah, so by the end of 2013, I believe that from an R&D standpoint, about 90 or so tests had been, we thought, validated at that time on the TSPU. A subset of those went live in the clinical lab on the TSPU. I believe that was about 15 around 2013. There were also other chemistries that we had developed that were running on other platforms beside the TSPU. Does that make sense?
Okay, so 90 tests were validated to run on the TSPU in 2013.
I believe so. About 90.
Okay, but only 15 were being run in the clinical lab.
Yes.
Why weren't you running the other remaining tests out of the 90?
We put, well, out of the 90,
Why weren't you running the other 75 tests on the TSPU?
so the reasons changed over time. Around 2013, I think we were initially working to bring up in the clinical lab setting additional tests on the TSPU, and then at some point in time we stopped and focused on the modified platforms, as well as just trying to get those tests through the FDA so that they could be used in the phase 2 setting. So the business model evolved and the strategy evolved.
Okay, so even though you had 90 tests validated on the TSPU, you decided only to run 15 on the TSPU because you had to get approval for the tests?
So
And you decided to focus more on the modified protocol with the third-party commercially available machines?
Yeah, and so just on that point, there were, I believe, about 90 development and validation reports with tests on the TSPU. The remainder we had done through other platforms. The subset of those went live in the clinical lab on the TSPU. The remainder of the focus in the clinical lab, as I understand it, was on the systems that could process a lot of samples at the same time. I think there was some work to get more than 15 up, but I know that that work stopped, and I don't know when.
You mentioned
Yeah.
sort of the distinction between the 15 tests that were ready to go as LDTs versus the 90 that were, in your words, validated on the platform. In your mind, what was the difference between having a test be an LDT versus it being validated for the platform? I guess,
Yeah.
what's the difference between the two?
Sure. So when I use the words validated for the platform, I was referring to our understanding of the development guidelines that were required for these tests, namely the FDA assay development reference. The clinical lab had its own separate validation process for any tests that went live. And so there were separate activities that were underway for each of those 15 prior to the lab director signing off on them.
And did you have an understanding at the time about substantively what that meant? I mean, in terms of, what the folks in the lab were doing to...
No, I knew that they had a separate validation process. I didn't know what the differences between the two were in a substantive way.
So it sounds like there were two different kinds of validation processes that were being performed on the TSPU. The first was, according to what you said, the FDA guidelines.
I think, in retrospect, it's what we had interpreted to be FDA's guidance document for assay development. And so when I use the words developed and validated, that's what I'm referring to.
Okay, but you mentioned before there were some characteristics of that validation process, including certain measures like test specificity
Yeah.
and precision and some of these other categories. That was
Correct.
what your understanding was with respect to how to validate the device under the FDA guidelines?
Yes, those are elements of that process, and then
Okay.
there were certain criteria that were acceptable for each of those sets of experiments that we had used that guidance document as an indicator of making sure that we were as good as we had wanted to be.
Okay. And then you mentioned there was a separate validation procedure that the CLIA lab was doing. Is that
Yes,
right?
correct.
Okay. And so as of 2013, only 15 tests had been validated under the CLIA procedure
Correct.
on the TSPU.
Yes. I think.
But you have no understanding as to what that CLIA procedure for validation is.
My understanding is that it's similar, but that there's some parts that are different, and that it's specific to essentially what the lab director determines are the acceptance criteria for a lab-developed test. I don't know specifically what aspects were different from our own development and validation of the assays.
Okay. And then going back to then the third-party commercially available machines that Theranos had modified, how many tests could those machines perform?
And just so I answer the question best, could they perform, meaning how many LDTs had we validated in the clinical lab
Yes.
on them? I believe there was about 60 or so. I'm not sure what the exact number was.
Okay, so about 15 were validated pursuant to the CLIA procedure on the TSPU at
Yes.
that time, and 60 were on the modified commercially available machines.
Yes.
Okay, and then
And just to be clear, those numbers are not exact, but it's about those numbers.
Okay.
I don't know the exact numbers.
okay, but in terms of the numbers, you would think it would be something less than 100 on the modified machines?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of the third category of machines, which would have been just the regular third-party commercially available machines that were running venous blood, how many tests could those machines perform? Would it just be the remainder of the test that Theranos is offering?
Well, we ran the remainder either on those or by sending out to the reference labs. And I don't know exactly how many were on the commercial machines.
Okay, but they would either be performed on the third-party commercially available machines, or they would be sent out to reference
Correct,
labs.
yes.
Just a couple clarifications there. So the 15 or so that were on the TSPU and the 60 or so that were on the modified commercially available, are those mutually exclusive sets, or is there any overlap between the LDTs on those
That's a great
platforms?
question. I think the way we're counting them, it's mutually exclusive. So the open platforms were capable of running a couple of the tests that we put on the TSPU. I don't know whether we ever ran them on both. I think for the purpose of this discussion, it's okay to consider them as different tests.
And then you sort of just thinking back through your answer about you understood that there were 15 LDTs that were on the TSPU. There were about 90, again ballpark, that were validated in the company's view at the time on the TSPU.
No, oh, sorry, yeah.
Was there ever a situation where someone at the company told you that additional LDTs weren't being brought onto the TSPU because of challenges in getting those, one of those 90 validated to the Theranos understanding tests up to the LDT standard?
I can't remember any specific conversations. I knew that there were ongoing sort of initiatives and challenges in general in bringing LDTs up, but I thought that the fact that our lab director had signed off on the reports for the first 15 meant that there were no fundamental issues in the ability to bring up more tests, and certainly believed that as we worked to then take those same tests that we'd done the development on into the pre-submission process for FDA.
Handing to you what's been marked Theranos Exhibit 197. Just tap through for everyone. Exhibit 197 purports to be a June 11th, 2013 email from Sunny Balwani to Elizabeth Holmes. The subject line is forward demo next Tuesday, 6/11 at noon, with starting dates number TS-0902539. Have you seen Exhibit 197 before?
I don't remember it. I'm not sure.
Is this your email address at Theranos, eholmes@theranos.com?
It is.
Do you have any reason to believe that you might not have received this?
I don't.
What is this email about?
Do you mind if I take just a sec
Yes,
to
of
read
course.
looks like it's an exchange on trying to do a demonstration of one of the mini lab devices.
Okay. And do you recall who that demonstration was for?
No.
So if you look at the initial email on the bottom of the second page, which is 540, is writing to, see that email?
I do.
And he states, or he writes rather, Sonny mentioned that he'd like to run a demo during an exec meeting next Tuesday. It runs from 12 to 2 p.m. in our office here. Do you know what he's referring to when he says exec meeting?
I don't.
Is exec short for executive?
I'm assuming so, yes.
And did you have executive meetings at Theranos?
Honestly, I'm not quite sure what an executive meeting is. I currently hold executive team meetings. I don't think that's what this is referring to.
Okay. Do you think it might be referring to a meeting with a business partner or someone from the outside?
I'd be guessing. I have no idea.
So if you then flip to the first page at 539, you'll see that as they're setting up this demonstration is then writing on June 10th to a number of individuals at the company, including, and he's copying Sunny Balwani at the bottom. He says, for tomorrow's demo as listed below, we'd like to have a mini lab and either a 4S or mono bay with the Normandy shell uploaded, whichever works better. So he's mentioning a number of different devices. There's the 4S and the mono bay. Do you know what he's talking about here?
So I'm not sure specifically. I think just looking at the chain here and the reference to mobile labs up above, that he's distinguishing 4S as the device that we'd been investing in for the DoD deployments that we had wanted to do, and the mono bay as the version of it which we later began to think about as the mini lab that could be used at retail or physician offices.
What was the difference between the 4S and the mono bay?
The 4S was designed to be much more compact and to try to be developed to some of the standards that were set by Special Operations Command for things that could be lifted and transported in a way that their command could handle, and it also had a lot of investment in things like vibration mounts to make it more robust for use in more difficult settings.
Okay. And so how is the mono bay different from that?
It was not intended to be used in sort of more extreme environments. It was designed for sort of a routine clinical setting, kind of like our wellness centers.
So in other words, was it bigger then than the 4S?
I think it was bigger, but it just didn't have the same vibration control and other things that would ultimately be required if you were going to do those types of deployments the DoD was interested in.
Were there any differences in capabilities between the two devices?
I don't know. There might have been. I'm sure there was. I don't remember specifically what.
Who would know the answer to that question?
Just looking at the email to. I don't know specifically. The product teams that were working on it at the time, who's listed here, I'm sure would have known what this was referring to at the time.
Okay. And when it mentions the Normandy shell being uploaded onto the machine, did you understand what he meant by that?
I'm not completely sure what he means by that. It's a piece of software, and I don't know why he wants to put that software on it. It must have been for some type of demonstration purposes.
What is the Normandy shell?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
So you just said it's a piece of software. Did you know what the software did?
I don't. I know that there was a reference. I know it's software because it says Normandy Shell, and so that is probably some type of shell software system. I don't know what code it refers to. It might be a version of the software that allows you to report results from the device, but I'm purely guessing based on looking at the email now.
What is Normandy?
Normandy is a word that was used to refer to a number of different projects internally. Insofar as I was familiar with it, it referred to the concept of having samples sent to a central lab through the nanotainer in phase 1 of our sort of business model, and then later deploying the device. I know Sunny used it in the software setting, and I think even in the lab setting for a number of different purposes. I'm not quite sure exactly all the use cases.
So if you look at the response then back from, which is just above email, he says, I've just finished getting the device OS installed with the Normandy app and properly running the null protocol on mobile labs 4 and 8. So what did you understand him to be saying there?
I just sort of, you're asking to interpret the document now, or are you asking whether it refreshes a recollection going back to that time period?
I'm asking her what her I mean, it sounds like she doesn't necessarily
remember, yeah.
recall this
Yeah,
this
okay.
email, but I'm asking what her understanding is of what's being written in this email now.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it now, it says he's installed software on it. I don't know what the null protocol was. And I think that the mobile labs is a reference to the version of 4S at that time, but I'm not sure.
So you don't know what null protocol is referring to?
I don't.
Have you ever heard that that phrase before?
I don't recognize it. I may have heard it before. I don't know what it is.
Okay.
I would guess it's a test protocol, but I'm not sure.
What do you mean by test protocol?
A lot of times when you want to make sure that the instrument is functioning properly, you have it's kind of like a QC protocol or a test protocol that allows you to ensure that whatever software you've installed or whatever configuration you've put the device in, it operates properly.
Okay. Did you ever conduct demonstrations where a blood sample was actually put into a device and the device, tested the blood sample? Did you ever conduct a demonstration like that?
Yes,
When did you do that?
very frequently. Many times over all the years.
And would you, after putting the blood sample into the device, would that device then generate a result?
If we put a blood sample into it,
Yes.
if it was programmed to, yes.
And were there times where you generated that result while, whoever you were conducting that demonstration for was present?
Yes.
Who do you recall doing that for?
Well, I know we gave one of the early versions of the Minilab to Walgreens to keep at their headquarters so that they could do that themselves whenever they wanted. I don't have specific recollections of the meeting, but I believe we brought devices to at least Safeway to use in their conference room and run samples on when we were first forming that relationship. I know we would do it, we've done it for board members a few times. I mean, whenever it was a relevant part of talking about that part of our business model.
Do you ever recall instances where you instructed others at Theranos to run a program on the devices so that it would look like the machine was running even though it wasn't actually processing a test?
We have test protocols that essentially allow you to show the device functioning. We will do that a lot, including for open systems of the open demonstrations of the device where you want people to see the architecture.
Okay.
So it runs essentially a, for lack of a better word, dummy protocol, so that you can see how the inside of the instrument moves or see the user interface or those types of things.
Right, so even if it's not processing a test, you would be able to see that the machine is actually running inside? Is that what a test protocol is for?
Either running inside or seeing how the software GUI works on the outside.
And do you recall using those test protocols a lot during your demonstrations?
I mean, again, we would do demonstrations in response to questions or interest in certain parts of the system. So we do it a lot now because we show open sort of versions of the device to show people the architecture. I know we did it at certain points in time in the past, depending on what the context of the meeting was and what people were interested in seeing about the device.
Was there a name for, so in those instances in which you were actually testing a blood sample and it's going into the machine, was there a name for the program or the software that would be uploaded to the machine in order to do that?
I don't know.
Who would know the answer to that question?
Name for the software to run the test protocol?
I'm actually talking about the instance. It sounds like, from what I understand, what you've just been saying is that the test protocol is something that can be put on the machine to sort of mimic how the machine would work if it was testing a sample. But
Sure.
is there a separate program that would be put on a machine in the case that you're conducting a demonstration where you're actually putting in a blood sample?
So if you're putting in a blood sample and you're reporting a test result, then the test result will be specific to whatever chemistry is on that cartridge, and that's what's reported out to the end user in the end. If you're, I'm not quite sure.
So maybe I don't understand how the machines work. Are they already, as a default, programmed to conduct tests on blood samples? So in other words, you would put the blood sample in, the machine would conduct the test, and the test result would be generated?
So the way that our TSPU systems work is that on each cartridge there's a barcode, and that barcode can be specific to a chemistry that's loaded into the cartridge. It could be specific to a test protocol, like a QC protocol, or if it was going to go through the movements but not actually run an actual chemistry, and anything else that you would want the instrument to do. So it would be determined by what's ever on the cartridge, if that makes sense, whatever barcode is on the cartridge.
So the barcode on the cartridge determines whether it's running one protocol versus another?
Yes.
So when you're talking about the test protocol, is it not a software that's being loaded onto the device?
I'm not aware of so there's an operating system on the device. The protocol, I believe the barcode calls a server and then it determines what protocol to run based on what's on the barcode.
Okay. And then if you look back at Exhibit 197 then, responds that same day, and he says, right now we're not planning to run anything on the mini lab, unfortunately. The general chemistry and ELISA assays are not performing adequately for a demo at the moment. So is that right? Is ML referring to the mini lab?
I think so. Given the references here to mobile labs and mini lab, I'm not quite sure exactly what it's referring to, but it could be.
Okay, and so he's actually responding back to Sunny Balwani's question about what you're planning to run on the ML. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, so it sounds like the general chemistry and the ELISA assays were not performing, or were not, I guess, performing accurately or adequately on the mini lab at that time. Does that refresh your recollection that the mini lab was not actually performing assays in this time frame?
It doesn't. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they could have had issues with it. I mean, we, as you know, been doing immunochemistries for many years on earlier versions of this platform.
Okay, but they're actually talking about the 4S and the monobay.
I don't know.
Was it,
I
so is
don't-
it your understanding that the 4S and the monobay could conduct testing?
Yes.
How many tests could, we had this conversation
Yeah.
earlier, but how many tests could the 4S or the 4 Series mini lab perform?
My understanding was that we were going through the process to take all of the chemistries that we developed, the few hundred that we were talking about, and put them onto the 4 Series platform. I don't know which of these this is referring to, and begin the process of getting them into the FDA later in 2013.
Okay, and so was it your understanding then that those tests were validated on the mini lab 4S?
The development and validation work I don't think was on the 4S device, but it was my understanding that the validation on the 3 Series translated to the 4 Series. So you would have to run it again on the 4 Series hardware, but it was essentially the same architecture of a robot moving fluid around, now with more detectors for different readouts.
So maybe I don't understand. So was the mini lab 4 Series performing any tests in 2013? Was it capable of performing any tests?
I thought it was. I mean, I'm saying that just based on remembering engaging with the FDA. We brought it to the FDA and we began the pre-submission process on it with the FDA that year.
And had you validated those tests on the mini lab 4S?
Again, I think the development and validation reports were on earlier iterations of the hardware, but we believed, and I believed, that you could basically take the same chemistry that's been created and run it on this iteration of the hardware. Just to be clear, you said 4S. I'm speaking generally about Minilab. I don't know if it was 4S or another version of the 4 Series platform.
Okay. I think probably we should clarify that when we're talking about the mini lab, at least with respect to this email, we're talking about the 4 Series mini lab.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you think that maybe during this time frame there were some issues with being able to adequately perform the general chemistry or ELISA assays on the Minilab 4S, but that generally speaking, your understanding was that these devices could conduct the test?
My understanding was that architecturally, what we had created with the 4 Series from a hardware perspective was sound, and that all the chemistries that we'd made over the years could be put on it and taken through the FDA, as we later did with HSV, which got cleared. I certainly knew that, like with any new technology that was coming up, there would be issues, but I was never aware that there were any showstoppers in being able to do that with the 4 Series platform.
Okay, you can put that one aside.
Appreciate it.
So I'm going to turn to you what's been marked Theranos Exhibit 198. This is tab 4. Exhibit 198 purports to be a January 23rd, 2014 email to Elizabeth Holmes with a copy to a number of individuals. Starting dates number is TS-0469-692. Have you seen Exhibit 198 before?
I recognize it. I don't know if I've seen it since sending it, but I recognize it.
What is Exhibit 198?
It's an email exchange between me and with the FDA.
So if you look at your initial email on January 22nd, 2014, you're noting in your email, I think you're getting ready to provide a copy of some updated plans for some pre-submissions to the FDA. Do you see that?
I'm sorry, where are you?
Your email to.
Okay.
Do you see that you're providing him with a copy of an updated plan?
Yes.
That's in the first sentence
Yes.
of your email.
Yes.
You then say, for your reference, as of now, Vit D, is that short for vitamin D?
Yes.
TSH, PSA, and FT4 ELISA assays are the only assays run through the Theranos processing device in Theranos' CLIA lab on patient samples collected at Theranos Wellness Centers. Was that consistent with your understanding that there were only 4 tests that were being run on the Theranos, I guess the TSPU, from patient samples being obtained from the wellness centers at Walgreens?
I'm sure it was at that time. We were making sure to keep the FDA completely apprised of everything we were doing.
Okay. Do you know why only 4 of the assays were being run on the TSPU during this time? And this is January of 2014.
I don't. If all 15 of them had been brought up by then this is probably just based on the orders. We also hadn't really seen that many patients on fingerstick by this period of time.
Was there a time when the number of tests that were being performed on the TSPU changed? Was it just a matter of bringing the next, 11 or so tests online and having them validated?
No. We generally looked at this based on ordering patterns, and our belief was, and still is, that about 70 assays will cover almost 100% of the orders that you'll get from the types of physician practices that we were trying to serve. So the goal was to match that test menu. As I said earlier, I think there was a period of time in which we thought more than 15 would go up. I know that changed, and I'm not sure exactly when it changed, but we weren't necessarily just linearly looking at bringing up more assays on an ongoing basis.
Okay. So what is your understanding as to the maximum number of tests that the TSPU ever performed on patient samples from Walgreens?
I think it's that 15 number.
It's that 15.
Yeah.
You can put that one aside. I'm handing to you what's been marked there, and it's Exhibit 199.
Is the difference here that mine's two-sided?
Yes,
Okay.
that's why it's a little thicker.
Thanks.
Exhibit 199 purports to be defendant Theranos Inc.'s responses and objections to the plaintiff's first set of interrogatories that were filed in the Court of Chancery of the State of Delaware in the Partner Investments LP versus Theranos Inc. case. Have you seen Exhibit 199 before?
I don't know. I might have.
Are you aware that there was a lawsuit that was filed by Partner Investments and PFM Healthcare Master Fund against Theranos?
Yes.
Were you involved in preparing responses to their interrogatories?
I certainly was engaged with our legal team on responding to them. I don't know what my specific role was in responding to the interrogatories. I'm sure I talked with our team about it. I may have seen some of the documents. I don't have a specific memory of what exact documents I looked at sitting here.
Sure. If you could just turn to the page with Bates number ending 3465. And just for the record, the starting Bates number on this document is SEC-PRM-E-000343. So are you on 3465?
Yes.
Okay, so here in interrogatory number 15, Theranos has submitted a response, and it looks like PFM is asking about the number of blood tests that were being processed through the TSPU beginning in January 1st, 2013 for clinical patient testing. Do you see the response here?
I do.
Okay, and Theranos responds that there are a number of tests that were being performed on the TSPU, and by my count, there are about 12 of them that start, and that list starts at 3465 and ends on 3466.
Yes.
You see that? Is that consistent with your understanding of the tests that were performed on the TSPU?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any reason to doubt this.
Okay. And looking at the list, were there any other tests that you believed were being tested or performed on the TSPU that aren't being listed here?
You know, if there's 12 here, I had the number 15 in my head. It may have been that either they weren't up by this period of time or they were never run, they were validated, or I could be wrong about the 15 number, I'm not sure.
Okay, so do you have any reason to believe that only 12 tests were being performed on the TSPU?
I don't know. If that's what this says, I don't have any reason to doubt it.
Did you ever share the fact that the TSPU was only performing about 12 tests with Walgreens?
I don't think so. I don't know.
You're not aware of an instance in which you might have told Walgreens that the TSPU was only performing 12 tests?
I'm not. Yeah.
Are you aware of ever informing Safeway that the TSPU was performing 12 tests in this time frame, 2013?
I mean, after the CLIA lab went live, I don't think we had any discussions with them about what we were doing in the clinical lab.
Did you ever share, or did you ever discuss the fact that the TSPU was performing about 12 tests with Sunny Balwani?
I can't remember a specific discussion about it. Yeah, I know there were discussions that we had about sort of stopping using the 3 series platform, working to get the 4 series into the FDA, and then our hope and goal was that we would be putting all the tests on that platform as fast as we could.
Okay, so do you know whether Mr. Balwani knew that the TSPU was only running something like 12 or 15 tests at the time?
I don't know, but I assume he would have.
Why do you say that you assume he would have?
Because he was managing the clinical lab.
What about others at the company? Did you ever discuss the fact that the TSPU was running about 12 tests with, for instance?
I don't think I ever had a specific discussion about the number of tests on the TSPU with him that I can recall. We had a lot of discussions about technology, including the TSPU, so it may have been an element of a discussion, but I can't remember a specific discussion about it only running 12.
What about the project managers? Did you ever discuss with them the fact that the TSPU was running something like 12 to 15 tests?
I don't think so. I mean, what the chemistries were running on in the clinical lab was not a focus of any of our discussions internally or really externally at that point in time.
Why wasn't it a focus of discussions?
Because in phase 1 of our model, it was about the chemistry. It was about redeveloping the assays to work with small volumes. And then phase 2 was about use of the TSPU in a distributed setting. And that was the vision, that was what we were spending most of our time working on. But how we operationalized the tests in the clinical lab in the meantime was just not something that any of us really focused on very much in conversation.
So can you explain for me, I guess, why Theranos decided to pursue commercial testing in phase 1? So I think I understand what you described there. Phase 1 is about getting the chemistries ready. Phase 2 is about the TSPU being out there. Why conduct commercial testing in phase 1 at all?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. The first is our business model shifted when we formed the partnership, after we formed the partnership with the retail pharmacies. And there was a lot of discussion about getting CLIA waiver on the devices and a concern about how long that would take and the regulatory model for it. No one had done this before. And so the decision was made to become a clinical lab. The concept with phase 1 was that the value is the retail footprint, right? Bringing lab to the retail footprint. And you've seen now Quest and LabCorp immediately go partner with Walgreens and Walmart to do that. To the extent we were focused on small samples, we invented the nanotainer to be able to work with the chemistries that we had redeveloped for small assays, and that was the concept for fingerstick-based testing in phase 1. In phase 2, the value proposition was to bring the device to the wellness centers to get tests even faster. And so that's what TSPU was about, because it processed one sample at a time. And in phase 1, you were going to have a lot of samples coming in at the same time. So phase 1 was retail footprint, access, low cost, transparent pricing, the $4 lab test concept, and then to the extent you were doing small samples, the nanotainer implemented with our chemistries. And then phase 2 was distribute the device. Right? And phase 2 was what we really wanted to do and is what we're still trying to do right now.
Is there a business plan or anything that articulated that? What you just
Not in a systematic way at that time. We did not have organized documents the way we do now that really lay all of this out.
Okay, you can put that aside. And actually, let's make a separate pile. Put that there, thanks. To you what's been marked. There it is, Exhibit 200. This is tab 9. Exhibit 200 purports to be Defendant Theranos Inc.'s first supplemental responses and objections to plaintiff's first set of interrogatories. Filed in the Court of Chancery of the State of Delaware in the Partner Investments versus Theranos Inc. case, with starting dates number SBC-PRM-E-0005120. Have you seen Exhibit 200 before?
I don't know, but again, I worked with our legal teams as we worked to respond to PFM.
So if you take a look at 5128, there's a supplemental response to that same interrogatory that we were just looking at in Exhibit 199, interrogatory number 15. Mm-hmm. And it says here, by way of further response, Theranos states the version 3.5 of the SPU is the only version of the SPU used. since January 1st, 2013 to process blood tests for commercial testing center patients. And that's consistent with your understanding that the TSP version 3.5 was the only device ever used for patient testing. Is that right?
The only version of the
Device.
mini lab family
Yes,
that was
sorry.
used, yes.
The only device manufactured by Theranos that was used for patient testing. Is that right?
That's right, and just for the sake of being explicit, we considered we actually injection molded and made the little cups that went into the hardware ourselves in our factory. So we considered ourselves as manufacturing some elements of the hardware for the other platforms as well.
Okay, so the sample cups that you were using with the Advia
Correct.
1800, those were Theranos manufactured
Yes.
cups as well?
We made them, yep.
Okay.
What were those called internally at the time?
So I don't know. I've seen a lot of references to different words used, I think, in describing the general concept. I've seen the word teacup. I don't know if that explicitly refers to what I'm referring to. I had understood that to refer to Theranos cup, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay. And then if you turn to, and actually, yeah, turning to the next page, 5129. Actually, at the bottom of 5128, if you want to follow through, it says by way of further response, Theranos identifies all other iterations of the SPUs since January 1st, 2013 as follows, and then there's a list on 5129, which lists, the 3.0, the 4.0, the Mini Lab Tower, the 4S, and the 4.1. If you take a quick review of that, of the descriptions of all of those versions, is this consistent with your understanding of those versions and what they were used for?
I think so generally. I don't have any reason to doubt it.
Okay. And what did the TSPU look like? And maybe they looked differently, so what did the 3.5 look like?
So they all look like a box with a screen on it, with a hole on the front that has a door, and you can stick what we call a cartridge, which is the piece of plastic that has all the chemicals in it, into it. And the cartridge has a little hole where you can put samples. You can put urine, or you can put blood from your arm, or you can put the little nanotainers with the finger stick in there.
And you said they all look very similarly?
Generally, yes.
Generally. What was the size of one of the 3.5s? What were the dimensions of that
I don't
device?
know the specific dimensions, but we would sort of refer to it as being similar in size to a desktop computer that you would have under your desk.
And then turning to 5155 in Exhibit 200. You'll see there's a supplemental response in interrogatory number 27. Do you see that?
I do.
And what PFM is asking Theranos is to identify any non-proprietary or commercially available machine, equipment, or technology that you use to perform tests. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, and on the next page, Theranos provides its response with a table of devices purchased from third parties, and it goes from 5156 to 5158. Is this consistent with your understanding of the third-party devices that Theranos was using to conduct patient testing?
I wouldn't know, but I don't have reason to doubt this document.
And was that also your understanding, in 2014, so this was as of 2013 or since January 1st, 2013, but would this list be of devices that were being used by Theranos that were purchased from third-party companies, was that consistent with your understanding as of 2014?
Again, I wouldn't know. I didn't have direct involvement in what devices were being procured for the clinical lab.
But you don't have any reason to believe that this information is incorrect as of 2014 either?
I don't know. I don't know. I know that the business model shifted. I know that as of a period of time, we were understanding the value proposition on low cost and therefore trying to achieve automation and standardization in the clinical lab. So there was a big investment in standardizing on Siemens equipment. I don't know when exactly that happened. So these might have been different in different periods of time.
Do you need to switch the tape?
We just break for lunch. Doesn't make sense, yeah?
He's got 2 minutes left on this.
Yeah. No, why don't we switch the tape? If you guys don't mind, go ahead and switch the tape. We are off the record.
Yeah, it's been an hour.
This concludes media number 2 of Elizabeth Holmes. We're off the record at 12:43.